I'm grateful for the invitation to be here with all of you and to Science for Peace and the other groups that co-sponsor this lecture series. And I hadn't heard about it, so I was grateful through the web of connections to learn about the lecture series. And I'll come back because there's some very interesting speakers coming up. And I've always admired Gwyn Dyer, and so I'll try to make it for that as well. I would have loved to have come and heard what Lisa North would have said tonight, and I'm grateful to her for at least giving me a title for my random thoughts. Generating rights for communities harmed by mining, as she says. And so I'll try to hold to that, and thinking about how the work that we do, the work that I do, is at the service of communities that are facing the presence of a mining company, perhaps, that they didn't want or look for. So I wanted to say as well that I come to this conversation about mining in Latin America having been born in Calgary, Alberta, and then growing up in British Columbia, and kind of having been around oil and gas and mining all my life, and having relatives who are deeply involved in those industries in one way or another. So we do have interesting conversations over things like the Keystone pipeline when I go home for Christmas or Thanksgiving. So some of the pictures here, these are kind of in a random order, but some of the pictures are actually of mines in British Columbia. Then the others are different situations in Latin America. 30-odd years ago, I went to the Dominican Republic for the first time, and this was the first place I went to in Latin America. And I went, as many people do nowadays, with the church youth organization. So we went to the Dominican Republic to learn about what churches were doing and what communities were involved with. And it was very much an effort focused on coming into contact with communities and understanding what people were doing to transform their own lives. So it wasn't at all kind of a charity focus. It was much more how do we act in solidarity with communities as they try to find a way forward, very much informed by the liberation theology stream of the Christian faith. And so one of the things we did in the Dominican Republic 30 years ago was go and visit the Falconbridge mine in the sort of north central part of the country. And that year we were able to get into the mine and talk with the management, and that was and we asked questions about the ecology of the zone. What was happening to the land? What would happen when the mine closed down? What were their plans for reforestation, things like that? Reforestation, what's that? Not a clue. So, and then after the conversation with the people inside the mine, then we went outside the mine and met with the communities around the edges who were living in communities of dust, red dust. And that was kind of my first exposure to a mining set of issues. It was at the same time as there was much controversy over a company called Inco working in Guatemala during the Civil War there. And I'll come back around to Inco a bit later on, because the mine that Inco was mining 30 years ago is the same mine that Hudbay was involved with just a few years ago when a series of killings and other violence happened. So, but I'll come back to that. I wanted to say one more thing about who I am and how I come to this. I worked, as was mentioned before, I worked in different ways in Latin America over the past 30 years, and more back and forth between Canada and Latin America, and working for different news organizations sometimes, but sometimes different church organizations in different kinds of projects, sometimes working with people coming from Canada or the United States to learn about Latin America, and frequently writing about all of that. So in 2000, I had the opportunity to come back to Canada from Mexico, where I had been working, and to work with the United Church of Canada as the person responsible for its partner relationships in Latin America. So the way that the United Church, and I think other major churches tend to work overseas, is now in a kind of an alliance or partnership, companionship with churches and other organizations in Latin America. And very quickly, the people I was meeting would come to me and say, Jim, you know, there's this mine that's opening up, you know, in this town. And the company behind it seems to be a Canadian mining company. Do you know anything about that? And of course I didn't. You know, so Escal in Argentina or Tambo Grande in Peru, not a clue. But I came back and asked questions, and gradually a story began to emerge, and this was, again, around 2000 and slightly after, of really quite a massive expansion of Canadian mining investment in Latin America. And I think people are, I'll come back to this as well, but I think people are familiar with the broad strokes of that expansion, the increase in resource prices, the emphasis the Canadian government has put on resource extraction as an activity that supposedly Canadians are good at. And even as we destroy a whole manufacturing sector since 1988 with the first free trade agreement, the focus has been much more strongly on building up this whole set of activities around resource extraction. So there are two stories in particular that I wanted to share with you tonight, and one of them is from a situation in El Salvador, and the other is a situation in Guatemala. And so I'll start with the Salvadoran one, and then tell you about the Guatemalan one. And and I'll show you a video at some point in the middle of this too. And I think actually between the two of them. So what happened is this. You'll remember back in the 1980s, there were a series of civil wars in Central America. People who were kind of fed up with hundreds of years, generations of exploitation, took up arms, rebelled against the systems that had dominated them for quite a long time. In the case of Nicaragua in 1979, the revolution triumphed, and we had an 11-year experience of quite good government where priorities were rearranged in favor of landless peasants and literacy, education, healthcare, and so on. Meanwhile, in El Salvador and Guatemala, the fighting continued through and into the 90s without success. Eventually, there were peace accords in both El Salvador and Guatemala. One of the realities in El Salvador was that the government frequently, instead of the government forces didn't always attack the guerrillas directly, but rather attacked what they called the civilian bases of support. So they would bomb local communities, killing thousands and thousands of civilians in the process of trying to eliminate the guerrillas. This was a counterinsurgency strategy where they were trying to empty the sea of the, so that the fish couldn't swim in the sea. So this was the logic of the attacks on the civilian populations in both El Salvador and Guatemala. It's reprehensible. This is probably the same era that I came into contact with Science for Peace, and the good work that you all do. So one of the communities, small town, 800 or so people, in the northern part of Cabañas department, so northeast of San Salvador, chose to leave the community and go into exile in Honduras. And this was 1984 or so. in 1988, they chose to come back. And it was while they were in Honduras that colleagues of mine in the United Church and the Anglican Church, came into contact with them. One of the things that churches do fairly well is accompany displaced people and communities of refugees. Some other things maybe we don't do quite so well, but that's something that we're quite involved in. So some colleagues of mine met people from that community and then went back with them physically to Santa Marta at the end of the, when they chose to go back. This wasn't the end of the war, but it was the time that they chose to go back. And gradually, the people in the community said, we will continue to live as if we won the war. So they went ahead and decided to farm the land collectively to eventually create a community development organization called ADES, the Association for Economic and Social Development in Santa Marta. And now have a high school, for example, that graduates, that has, let me remember, that has about 1,000 students in it from all over the zone, and 100 graduate every year. It's a remarkable transformation done completely, well, initially with resources that they found from organizations like ours, but many other organizations. And then we're able, because of the strength of the community, to get support from the Salvadoran government to pay the teachers and maintain the school and do all the kinds of normal things. The same thing more recently with the health clinic in the community. It's now supported with government funds. So the work that they were doing initially, they've kind of moved on into other things. And so ADES kind of developed a way of working that I love, and I would love to see other organizations do it, where they kind of would create work, and then once it was kind of functioning, hive it off, and another organization would carry it forward. So they have a radio station called Radio Victoria. And Radio Victoria is a community radio station in El Salvador, and one of the good things in El Salvador is that it's possible to have community radio, and so there's a network of community radio stations throughout El Salvador. So Radio Victoria was a project of ADES that got farmed off. It runs its own show now. There's a community AIDS education project that began 12, 15 years ago called COCOSI, the Community AIDS Council. And this was created as kind of a peer-to-peer youth education project around HIV and AIDS prevention. Over time, it got linked in with other AIDS prevention work in El Salvador, but also in Honduras. And so it's also an autonomous NGO, if you like, non-governmental organization. A women's network of a micro-loan program for women, also set up and running on its own. For many years, ADES has been funded by, well, two sources in Canada, the United Church and the Anglican Primates Fund for World Development and Relief, but also has had funding from European agencies. And so their focus now really has been about improving farming techniques and more ecological farming and so on. So what happened? Around 2004, news came that a Canadian company wanted to reopen a mine that had been abandoned back in the 50s. And this is one of the things that that happens over time, is that new technology makes it possible, and the higher prices of the minerals make it worthwhile for old mines to be reopened. So this is a mine that had been thought exhausted back in the 50s. Now the higher price of minerals and the newer technologies made it possible to go back at it again. So this mine, it was proposed that it be reopened, and at first the people at ADES thought, great, a gold mine in our towns, that'll be a source of employment. And so they began asking some questions, and they heard a story of a place in Honduras called the Syria Valley. I don't know if people have heard about this. The Syria Valley is a place where Goldcorp, the Canadian company, had been running a mine, and it was at the point of closing or had just closed. And there was huge controversy. You can look it up when you feel inclined. But the Syria Valley was a mess. It was abandoned. It's still controversial. People are still sick and getting sick because it was never cleaned up at all. So people at ADES looked at what was going on in Honduras and they said there's a problem here. And then they began connecting with other organizations that were concerned about mining. And then they thought, well, what can we do to stop this? This is a bad thing. It's a threat to our communities. It's the mine would have an impact on our drinking water, not just the drinking water of our communities, but on it's in the river basin of the Lenca River, which is like the supply of water to 50% of the people in El Salvador. And so so they began looking for ways to stop it. And in El Salvador, the government had a system where you could, where there was like a 2-week window in which community groups or municipalities could intervene in the environmental assessment process. So the government had done a report that was basically a whitewash of environmental impacts. There wouldn't be any. So what ADES did with support from the United Church and from Oxfam America was hire an expert from the United States who was able, within 2 weeks, to do an assessment of the government's assessment and say, this is not worth the paper it's written on, the Salvadoran government. And this was back in the time when the people who won the war were still running the government, the Arena party. They saw the examination of this environmental assessment and agreed with it. So they suspended the mining operation, and that decision was upheld by the subsequent government, the FMLN government. This is the people who had been the guerrilla forces back in the 70s and 80s, and after the peace accords in '92, became the political opposition and then eventually the government of El Salvador. So 2 successive governments from opposite sides of the political spectrum have both said no to this mine. So what does the company do? The company is a company called Pacific Rim. Again, Canadian-based, although the principal shareholders, the lead staff, and so on, are from the United States. The Pacific Rim created a subsidiary in the United States, and then that subsidiary used the Canada-Central America Free Trade Agreement to sue the Salvadoran government. And at first it was for $100 million or so, and then now it's around $300 million, this lawsuit. The president of the company, a man named Thomas Schrake, hasn't said a whole lot publicly, but he did speak at a parliamentary committee hearing a few years ago where he denounced our partner, ADES, as a rogue NGO. And this is actually one of the comments that keeps coming up from Pacific Rim, is that these are rogue NGOs or rogue churches that were somehow off the leash and being irresponsible or not being faithful to our purposes and so on. So rogue NGO. More recently, yes, this comment about churches has come up too. So one of the things that I have encountered in the little interaction I've had directly with mining companies is that they tend to think that non-governmental organizations go around looking for the bad things that mining companies are doing in different places. And the story that I've been telling you says it's not like that at all. What in fact happens is because churches are woven into the fabric of civil society, of community life in every village in the Americas, we hear the stories back. And when we hear those stories back, in some cases, we're able to respond and try to do something in solidarity with partners, as I said. So, so I think from the mining industry side, there's a misunderstanding of what it is we do, what it is community organizations do, and they think that we're out there to get them somehow. And it's not like that at all. It's much more that because we're involved in the lives of communities, that the stories come back to us. And just to leave aside the situation in El Salvador for a moment, another example would be in Peru, where one of the other early experiences that I learned about was a situation called, it was a situation in a community called Tambo Grande, where a Canadian mining company called Manhattan Minerals wanted to basically take half of the town, like the town site, not out on the edges, but half of the town, and destroy it and put in a mine. So the legal defense work of the community leaders who were accused of all kinds of horrible things by the mining company was handled by an organization called Fede Paz. And Fede Paz is a church-backed human rights organization with a special expertise around providing legal advice to people who were accused of crimes. And they've developed a special niche, I think, around mining issues in Peru. So Fede Paz handled the legal defense of the community in Tambo Grande, and they continue to do that work today. And it's, again, a United Church of Canada partner. We've been funding them for years, since long before we knew that they had anything to do with mining. So again, I know this is going to be on video, and I know that our friends at Gold Corp and some of the other companies keep an eye on what we say and we do. So I'll just speak back to them that it's because we are involved in every community in the hemisphere that we hear about these stories. We bring them back to Canada and we tell people like you about them. It's not because we're out there looking for dirt that happens. So anyway, so I'm going to pause for a moment and show you a video. This is a video that was created after a conference of leaders of churches and community organizations that are all, one way or another, involved with Canadian churches. And the video is called Remember the Land, Global Ecumenical Voices on Mining. So it's about 10 minutes long, and I think you'll hear quite a variety of situations, not just in Latin America, but around the world. And then we'll come back and I'll tell you a bit more about the Marlin mine in Guatemala and some other situations in Guatemala. Well, there were two things I wanted to say more about the situation of the resistance in the Cabañas department in El Salvador and what's going on now with that company. So the first is that the decision to oppose the mine has had terrible consequences for the communities. 4 people have been murdered. And I wouldn't say it was because of the mining company being behind them. It was more likely the people in the community, the communities who stood to benefit from the presence of a mine, still linked back to those old death squads that we heard about in the 1980s, that those people carried out the killings of selected leaders or people who were involved in the struggle against the mine. So just it's not light. There were also many threats. A priest in the communities, the community radio station that I mentioned before, Radio Victoria. So we've had to be very attentive and work with other organizations to defend the human rights of people who've been affected by their choice to resist the mining. The other thing that's gone on, I mentioned the lawsuit. Pacific Rim probably drove itself to the point of almost bankruptcy by pursuing that. It's a long, slow process through the, as I said, the U.S. Central America Free Trade Agreement. So to keep the lawsuit alive and to avoid setting any precedents, a company called Oceana Gold from Australia has bought Pacific Rim. it's a much larger company, but they have the resources to be able to pursue this lawsuit until it's resolved. It was very interesting for me, as somebody who's kind of walked with ADES, and you saw the Vidalina Morales was one of the people you saw in the video. Vidalina was the president of ADES for many years, and she's now become kind of the international spokesperson around these sets of issues. And immediately, the same kinds of organizations like ours working in Australia invited her to go to Australia, and I believe she's there right now, speaking about the same situation. It's again that web of organizations that have a certain power to work with other groups and stop things. So we're going to keep up this struggle, even though the part of the scenario at least has moved to Australia. Goldcorp and Guatemala. This is another complex set of issues, and it came to our attention in a way that's a little bit different, but kind of illustrates the same point I've been trying to make. At the end of the 1990s, a company called Montana Resources, Montana something. Montana was doing some exploration in the far western end of Guatemala, near the Mexican border, in the department of San Marcos, and apparently found some gold. So the owner of Montana eventually was a Canadian company called Glamis Gold. So Glamis Gold then financed a further exploration phase and the initial construction of the mine. But this is the pattern that gets repeated around the world. Relatively small companies are involved in the early stages, and then later the larger companies with a lot more capital can come in and actually set up the mine. So that's what happened here. Goldcorp bought the Marlin mine that Montana and Glamis had got going in 2006. By then, there had already been 5 or 6 years of controversy about the mine. This is an area where most of the people are of Maya ancestries and of the particular linguistic group called the Mam people. But there's a subgroup called Sipicapa, another group of indigenous people in the same area. So people live in different communities, and initially it was the strongest focus of resistance was coming from the Sipicapa side. As people became aware of the mine, and again, particularly aware of what had gone on in other places, notably the Syria mine experience, people raised questions. There was community opposition. Eventually, there were community plebiscites. People voted no. Since then, all over Guatemala, communities, sort of one at a time, have held hundreds of community referenda, like these community plebiscites. And the votes are always, 99.5% against mining. A Kairos partner called SEBA is one of the organizations that's been very involved in leading the process of working with communities, giving them the tools, whatever they need, to be able to hold these plebiscites. So community after community has been holding these plebiscites. The companies, unfortunately, have kind of pressed ahead. The Goldcorp mine, the Marlin mine, has been there now long enough for people to make pretty solid representations about health impacts in the community, impacts in water, and so on. The Roman Catholic Diocese of San Marcos has been doing water studies, and so there's a whole body of scientific material that the company, of course, contests with other scientific material, they say. But there's this kind of clash of opinions that you can follow on the internet. For me, the critical thing is that the communities have been saying no, and this is particularly important in the Guatemalan context, as it is where I come from in British Columbia. Indigenous rights and what elements that brings to the conversation. In international law, there's something called free, prior, and informed consent. Indigenous communities have the right to say yes or say no to projects or development projects, if you can call them that are proposed. And governments have the responsibility to ensure fair processes that involve communities in gaining their consent for anything that goes forward. Therein lie 1,000 stories in Ontario, British Columbia, other parts of Canada about how consent is obtained. And if you watch how the pipeline debates go in the next few years in Canada, you can learn a lot about free, prior, and informed consent in Canadian law. In the Guatemalan context, the government says it will decide for Indigenous people, and it's the only body that can make that decision. That's been contested in the courts in Guatemala. The Guatemalan organizations have made good use of Guatemalan courts despite the difficulties. They've taken it also to the Inter-American Court. Difficulties there too, but back and forth. But there's now a pretty lively conversation that's engaged everyone around free, prior, and informed consent in Guatemala, and the whole set of issues around Indigenous rights and development. This the issue of the mine in the Marlin mine in San Marcos came to us because back in the 1980s, the United Church encouraged people from Canada to get involved with local communities in Guatemala. This was done by lots of other organizations too. There were all kinds of solidarity projects between Canada and Central America, and some of those continue. So one of the organizations created back then was something called Breaking the Silence, which is a Maritimes-based network of people interested and committed to issues in Guatemala. A large number of United Church people are involved in that, and that involvement has also informed how we make choices and how we set priorities and the conversations that we have at the national level and in other parts of the church. But it's breaking the silence that for us was the point of connection to what was going on in San Marcos. And I won't say anything here that hasn't been said already publicly in public debates, but we've done everything we can to learn about the issues in San Marcos and meet people on all sides of the question, including the company. It's partly driven by the fact that the United Church of Canada Pension Fund owns shares in Goldcorp. So that became one of the points of controversy. Now, this shouldn't surprise anybody that a pension board owns shares in a mining company. The Canada Pension Plan also owns shares of Goldcorp. The pension funds that are controlled by public sector unions own shares in Goldcorp. It's controversial everywhere. And we try to work to some extent together in trying to find ways forward. But pension boards guard their space quite jealously and don't really want to or feel compelled to take advice from people like me or the Bishop of San Marcos, who you saw there. So this is an ongoing debate in the United Church, but it's an ongoing debate in lots of other places. And it's one that if you're involved in a pension plan, you can ask questions about. Just about every pension plan that we know about is also involved in Enbridge or the pipeline companies that we're hearing about these days too. So we've been learning quite a lot about fiduciary responsibility of pension boards and so on. But I'm not going to go into that any more deeply unless people really want us to go there. Breaking the Silence and the United Church continue to work closely. We're co-sponsoring a delegation of United Church people who are going to Guatemala at the end of November. And these delegations happen once or twice a year. They always come back with people re-energized to carry on the struggle and to ask difficult questions. I think I won't, well, maybe just a couple more things about Guatemala. There are opinion polls. 66% of Guatemalans oppose mining. But then they will say things like, this is again the church leaders that will say, we're not against development, we're against the behavior of these companies. Like they find that it's very difficult, if not impossible, to engage in a kind of a dialogue among equals. The companies have so much money, they come in with an assumption that they have the right to the land and the resources under the land, and the communities say, no, wait a minute. We don't have pension funds. We don't have investments. All we have for our future generations is this land. If you take that away from us, what are we leaving for future generations? They will say to us when we try to explain our pension boards. So they make all kinds of recommendations about different ways that the companies could behave, different ways that the government of Canada could behave, because very often the government of Canada facilitates the entry of these companies, again, out of the logic of expanding the Canadian economy. But this really is a clash of worldviews and values, and I think the video reflected that fairly well. In Guatemala, 80% of the people live in poverty. This is the church leader, Vitalino Similosh, speaking. Our mountains, forests, and rivers have been stolen by major corporations, which are building hydroelectric power stations, mining coal, doing oil research, or growing a monoculture crop. The natural resources and the rights of Maya people are still being violated today as they were, well, he was talking about well, let's go back, 520 years, 521 years now. Those at the back probably can't see this, but the symbols are familiar to you. 1492, a ship full of gold, a Christian cross, blood, and then the word America. Of course, for Latin Americans, America always refers to the whole hemisphere, never just that one country. But that history, this sense of having always been exploited, that the veins of Latin America are always open, and that people are always bleeding, is incredibly strong. This is a poster that was done by a friend of mine from Chiapas in Mexico in 1992, at the time of the 500th anniversary. So he loaned it to me tonight so that you could all see it. So what I think many of the community organizations and churches, the people that I'm involved with, are looking for ways of leveling out the ground so that more honest dialogue can happen. And that involves work that goes on in Guatemala, El Salvador, Brazil, in Peru, and so on. But it also involves work that goes on here. And so going back to Lisa North's title for our evening, which was generating rights for communities harmed by mining, part of the task is here. Looking for one piece of, yes, here we are. So there have been a number of campaigns to try to change Canadian laws so that there can be some, at least minimal, regulation of the Canadian companies as they operate overseas. Right now there are no laws at all. The United States, Europe have some rudimentary laws, and this is one of the reasons that so many of the mining projects, mining companies are are based in Canada. About 75%, in fact, of the world's exploration and mining companies are registered in Canada, 75%. So what we've tried to do over the past 10 years has been to make legislative change. One of these efforts was Bill C-300, a private member's bill sponsored by John McKay from Scarborough, that just barely lost in the House of Commons just before the last election in the minority parliament. But that struggle for change in legislation has not stopped. And even though there's probably no realistic hope of changing the law right now in this parliament with the Conservative majority, we'll keep working towards the future. So one of the areas that needs attention is making it possible for Canadian courts to hear claims by non-Canadians who have been negatively affected by overseas operations of Canadian companies. So this is the issue that's raised by that other Guatemalan case, the case that we've been hearing about, the Hudbay situation, where Hudbay is a Canadian company that bought a mine, the former Inco mine, and then has since sold it to another company called Sky Resources, which I think is based in Russia. But during the time that Hudbay owned it, some incidents occurred. And so far successfully, people from who were, well, the widow of one of the men who was killed, a man who was left severely handicapped, and 9 or 11 women who were beat up and raped by security personnel of the mine. They've been able to bring their lawsuit to courts here in Canada, here in Toronto, and so far it's proceeding. Everybody's kind of amazed by this, but so far it's proceeding, and it may be that eventually Canadian courts are kind of, you may have noticed this, Canadian courts are a little bit conservative and it takes a long time for change to happen. But it may be that some change is about to happen, and that's what we hope. And there's a really terrific film that some of us saw a week or two ago about that case, Defensora. And who was it who had the, yeah, you've got it, yeah. So, again, that's a case that illustrates the point about the need for Canadian courts to be open to claims. We're trying to find ways that the government of Canada will stop funding the mining companies for the work that they do. We're especially concerned about the ways that the government is now using what used to be CEDA, the official development aid that Canada provides. Like now, for example, the United Church of Canada and many other aid organizations aren't actually getting funding from the government of Canada for the first time in 50 years because they don't make it possible for organizations like ours to apply for money. You have to wait until they make a call, then you enter into a bidding process. And there hasn't been an open bidding process in more than 2 years. To me, it's incompetence on the part of our government. But anyway, it just hasn't that hasn't moved forward. So we're not getting any funding for that. But there are calls for funding. From the embassy in Colombia, just very recently, came a call for NGOs to bid on projects, but you have to do them together with a mining company. And it's for a lot of money, like $500,000 to $1 million. So if the United Church really wanted to go to Colombia and we would put up some of our money and the mining company would put up some of its money, then the Canadian government would put in a whole lot of money. We could be doing something like building schools or community clinics or what have you next to the mine that supposedly softens the opposition. Well, we're not going to do that. And reputable NGOs will not do that either. So, and it's a bad thing and we want it to stop. So anyway, yeah. And then also, I always, I think if you look for my name on the internet and free trade, Jim Hodgson free trade, you'll find a bunch of stuff, because I've been on about this since 1988. That free trade agreements aren't just about trade. It's not just about bananas and pork and apples. They really do provide cover for the large corporations to do horrible things. So the investor protection part of a free trade agreement is the most dangerous part of the free trade agreements. It allows these companies to do whatever they want, and then if somebody says, the community health organization says, no, you can't do that, then they'll sue the national government. We've just seen this over and over and over again, that governments end up paying corporations when they're really trying to set out to protect the health or the environment. So again, I'll stop there. Don't get me going on free trade. Last thing. Let's put a whole lot of hope in the political changes that have been going on in Latin America. I think that over the past 50 or 60 years, or maybe even longer, there's been an explosion of these organizations that I've been talking about, community-based groups that want to change something. They want to change the situation of women. They want to have the rights of Indigenous people recognized. They want to change how agriculture is carried out. They want to have community radio. They want to, they want to transform their societies from the grassroots up. In the last 20 years, those groups have really come together through things like the World Social Forum, and they've had a big impact on the political systems. And so that over time, the ideas that emerge in these civil society organizations, in all those tiny little groups all over the place, have come together into coherent political agendas that are transforming one country after another. The most radical changes are probably in Venezuela, Bolivia, and Ecuador. But you know what? All three of those countries are also perhaps the most dependent on resource extraction to be able to fund anything like healthcare, education, protection of Indigenous rights. And all the time, in those three countries, but all the others too, there are collisions over resource extraction. But my hope is that even in those places where the collisions are sharp, Peru, Colombia, the space for the civil society organizations, the space for community groups, the space for Indigenous people opens up and strengthens so that they can say no when they need to say no, or they can say yes but with conditions, or no, not there, but yes over here. You know, that we can all have a more mature and more complex set of debates, but in places like Colombia, of course, you know, where there's like still a very brutal government and backed up by armed forces and paramilitary death squads, even though they're supposedly dismantled. It's not true. In the two countries with the worst human rights records in the hemisphere, Colombia and Honduras, people are still fighting to open up the space for that sane, responsible conversation to occur. And so what we need to continue to do, as we've been doing, is to support communities, support Indigenous rights, support the space for people to organize and talk with each other, even in places where it seems like the situation is difficult or even hopeless, to keep at it. Things will change in Colombia and in Honduras, as they have been changing in lots of other places. Let's keep on exploring different visions of development. I think that and there are people who are far more expert than I am on this, the sort of European, North American emphasis on domination of nature has reached the end of its course, and that there's tremendous wisdom, I think, as we saw in the video, in indigenous ways of living and doing things that we can learn from. I'll stop there, and we can have some questions and some comments from all of you. I'm grateful for your time tonight and for coming out and seeing each other.